Well, I think if you go back to the traditional route of defining risk, over the last 30, 40 years of work that has happened in this field, I think it initially began with some sort of a hazard-centric approach. So people actually believed risk equated to a sort of an hazard, and I think that was an initial construct of how risk was assumed, that earthquake is a risk, flood is a risk, or XYZ is a risk. But I think over the last 30, 40 years, one of the significant achievements, in terms of understanding risk has been towards looking in terms of areas around exposure, issues around vulnerability, especially social vulnerability, and I think that has made a huge change in the way we look at risk. And so today, when you want to call anything as a risk, primarily from the disaster risk management perspective or from a climate change management perspective, it's all about trying to understand the interface that exists between the relation of the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability that is associated with it. Because when all these three things interact, I think that's where the confluence of these three circles, when they meet, defines in terms of what is the level of the risk. So it's all about the interface between these three key parameters. And that's how I typically see as risk in practice. There are quite a lot of definitions around it. I mean, when you look at, say, for example, volcanic eruptions, though it's a risk, but if it's in a location where you don't have a large number of people staying, I would rather say it's an event and less of a risk. And similarly, when you look at floods, for instance, you have floods and people settled around the river embankments or river across the river. I mean, you see risk from a different notion altogether. So it's all about how you mix these three circles and what is that interface that comes around the three. I mean, it's about exposure of the people, it is exposure of the infrastructure, and the assets what people have. So all these assets and people around that particular zone will be getting into some sort of a risk category. People would be falling under a moderate risk category or a high risk category. If you take an example of cities like Shimla or the case of Delhi, where when you talk about seismic risk, we say that typically we classify cities or any area under an influence of a hazard, where the hazard category itself could be in different ranges, so low, medium, high. And when you come across to cities like Delhi and Shimla, they are obviously under a high hazard risk. And within the city, there would be this whole function of vulnerability, which will define in terms of the risk to damage. So there's an additional dimension, when it comes in terms of defining risk from the hazard perspective and defining risk from the perspective of damage. So again, there are too many ways of looking at that layers of risk. But again, going back to what I said, it's about the confluence of these three parameters: the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability, which defines risk. Well, I don't think I mean, if you typically look in the context of India, I think the way people perceive risk, and it's got something to do with the culture. And I think a lot of, unless and until some sort of a detailed assessment is done, I mean, you just look at, let's just take an example of traffic. A lot of people who go without helmets do not perceive that there's a risk. And that is sort of a culture that we are living in today. And I think, that sort of a cultural shift and a sort of a good risk communication, I think that may alter the way people look at risk. Otherwise, it's quite a challenge for risk managers in this country to talk about risk in a very general sense. So I think that challenge exists, and it has been there for probably close to a decade or so. I think it goes back to two things. One is, if you look at how a place is getting exposed to a risk. Say, for example, cities or population, which is getting continuously exposed to an event. Say, for example, flood. Every year, they know during the monsoon time, there will be a sort of a flood situation. So there could be an enhanced, mechanism within that community or, that city to look and understand about how do we deal with that. But there are some sort of, events, which happens probably once in 100 years or probably once in 500 years. And these sort of events, I think most of the time, even the government is not really prepared for it, leave alone the communities. And it all takes a different, process to first undertake an analysis around it, convey it to the people, convey it to the stakeholders. And I think it just doesn't happen by having an article being published in the newspaper. I think a lot of things has to go around by taking this information to the communities, which is perceived to be under that risk. And I think it all goes back to like putting an effective communication strategy around an analysis, a technical report which is typically prepared in most of the cases. And I think it's all about how do you convince people, how do you convince institutions to take actions. And I think we're significantly lacking in that. A lot of analysis which is done in this country is almost concentrated on preparing a report, and later to that it ends up there. I mean, the reports really talk about some scary dimensions of risk, but I think it's not being really communicated to the key stakeholders.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, that's a good point that you make, because especially when it comes down to buildings and privately owned infrastructure or assets, then there's something. I mean, if anything needs to be done, it needs to be done by people themselves.
True.
The government
True.
cannot intervene
True.
after the point.
True.
So I believe that Himachal Pradesh had done this perception study, which was just to understand what people's perception of risk were.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the output of that exactly.
Well, I think there have been studies, which are being done to understand, how people perceive risk, and I think that's a beginning, because once you know how people perceive it, I think you can tailor make information in a way that you can go and talk to them in terms of say for example, let us take an example. It's a good example that you talked about Himachal. There has been a challenge in Himachal to convince a large number of stakeholders, including the communities, that the buildings are highly vulnerable to XYZ sort of hazards. And just taking the example from the 1905 Kangra event, and we have crossed almost 100 years since that event happened. If you look at the two different pictures of 1905 and say let us take today Himachal, the exposure of risk which was existing way back in the 1905, which killed quite a lot of people around, I think it was somewhere around close to 30,000 people getting killed, that has not been really well documented. That event has not been really well documented, except the scientific literature which runs behind it. And that message has been lost in the last 100 years. So in the last 100 years, what has really happened is that Himachal Pradesh as a state and the urban centers in Himachal Pradesh has accumulated a huge amount of risk. And should there be an event of a similar nature that was happened in the 1905 event, and there are scientific predictions around it in terms of having a mega quake around the Himalayan belt, I mean, I think we're going to probably see another huge devastation in that region. Now the challenge is once you do a perception survey or perception study in terms of what people think about risk, you get to know about what sort of a strategy you need to put in place to go back to them and convince them in terms of probably you can go back and talk about the 1905 event and position that event in front of people and probably have a series of debate around it. And that debate has to happen not just at the level of the government, but I think a lot of debate has to happen at the level of the communities who are not aware of the risk. And typically, one of the biggest factors what we have seen in Himachal, and we're doing an analysis of close to a large number of buildings around the state, close to about 20,000 buildings, what we realized is that most of the buildings, majority of the buildings in that state do not have any seismic safety feature inbuilt into it. So I think it throws open a huge debate in terms of though we have done a pretty good advancement in the field of science, that science has not really percolated to the institutions who are really governing the region by large. So I think there's a huge amount of disconnect, and I think unless and until a lot of work is done around making sure that the science-based information, the hazard-based information, which are done extremely well, you don't package it in an appropriate way to the institutions, because ultimately reaching out to the society will be done by the institutions, and that's so I think the institutional support which is primarily very important. What I also believe is let us take an example of a city like Surat, which suffers from regular floods. And way back in 2006, the city had a catastrophic event, and probably I think the estimated losses were close to about 22,000 crores. But what difference did that make? We went around doing a survey way back in 2008, 2009, and we did see some significant changes the way community has been trying to cope with that event, because they're not really sure in terms of how the situation would be during the period of the monsoons. But nevertheless, some of the early preparations that you see in the city, like say for example the monsoon preparedness plan for the city, in terms of cleaning all the stormwater drains. I think there's a preparedness which the municipal government actually took up. You take the example of the communities in some of those risk-prone areas within the city of Surat, stay very close to the embankments. They've been anyway shifted now. But when we went in 2008, we saw some very interesting facts. A lot of the furniture, were were not on the ground, they had some sort of additional support, so that when the water comes in, they don't get, submerged under the water. A lot of this important critical documents in the houses, like probably your ration card and, all those certificates of the children, etc., are all packed and kept at higher levels. So I think, it also depends on the type of the hazard. Say, for example, floods, they don't catch you by surprise most of the time. You have some sort of a lead period. And if you have a good early warning system in place, your respite time of not getting respite time in terms of, making the community aware of an oncoming event, that makes a huge difference. I mean, we have seen very recently in terms of how people in the state of Orissa were able to, reduce the loss in terms of loss of lives for the event that recently happened in 2013, the month of October. And when you compare that with the event that happened in the 1999 super cyclone, and there's a huge amount of reduction in loss of lives. I think, places which get, under the grip of hydrometeorological events on a regular basis, they have a different mechanism to cope. When you compare that with an event like in Shimla, where they have not really seen any major earthquakes, what they get is a few little bit of jolts here and there, and that doesn't really alter the dynamics of the community to be prepared for an event, and neither the institutions. So you go to Shimla and you talk to a large number of stakeholders, and they're really sure in terms of, a mega event in the region is going to bring Shimla and a large number of urban centers to the knees. They're fully aware of it, but the real challenge is, how do you translate all that information that you have to a wide mass of people and then take informed development decisions. I think handling of risk will be beyond the tenure of any government, which operates around a sort of a 5-year cycle. But I think more importantly, given that today, in this country we see a large number of urban centers, where you have huge amount of accumulated risk. I think it's high time that there are some mechanisms put in place to at least draw a line and say we won't add any additional risk. At the same time, I think this informed decision will come when cities or the state governments, or probably even the national government, prioritizes undertaking risk assessment in a large number of cities and towns in the country. What essentially it helps in understanding is that you get to know the fabric of risk. I mean, we know typically where the risk is, but I think it has to be further broken down in terms of understanding the dynamics of the risk in an area where you have to understand about the hazard, how it's going to act. You need to understand about the social vulnerability, and you need to come up with some sort of options to prioritize risk mitigation. And in order to reach to prioritize to that sort of a risk mitigation option, it's important that first you undertake a sort of at least a crude assessment in terms of understanding of the risk in that particular area. That will help you to look at two things. One is it will probably help you to look at high priority areas where risk has to be minimized. And in order to do that, there could be some sort of a redevelopment strategy that needs to be worked out. I mean, this has been done globally. Cities like Turkey, where risk was assumed to be very high for seismic, there have been areas which have been redeveloped. And so there are alternate mechanisms of looking into that. One is the insurance part of it, but I think redevelopment is always a better strategy to come out with. The other option is a whole lot of investment that's actually taking place. And then if you go back to some of the recent reports which has been brought out, I think in the next 15 to 20 years, or at least close to about 20 years or 30 years, India will actually will double the infrastructure that is already put in place. May it be housing, may it be, you talk about water supply, or probably XYZ, So that sort of an investment which is now getting into the cities or, a large number of towns. This risk assessment will probably inform them to look in terms of, what needs to be prioritized as far as the design of the infrastructure is concerned. And I think a lot of mitigation has to be built in, before you put something and then you think about retrofitting it. Because once you make an investment, retrofitting is quite a very expensive proposition. And I think that's quite a challenge where we need to really look at. So I would rather say, the quick fix to understand this problem is do a risk assessment, get this thing out in a public domain, put up some sort of a decision support tools around it. So don't make it as a document, where you can just keep it under the shelf. Put a sort of a online decision support system around risk, so that any public or a private institution which is coming down to look at development options for a given region gets access to that information. What we are doing within Taru is that we are trying to look in terms of how we can bring in a sort of a dynamic tool for some cities across the country, close to about 24 cities in the country, where this this dynamic tool can actually talk about the existing risk in that place. It also gives you a layer of vulnerability which is there, which will probably help some of the decision makers as well as people who are actually investing into those cities or other regions to prioritize and take this information of the hazard when they talk about making any investment. I think these sort of tools should be made available, and I think currently we don't have anything like that. And very recently, I think one of the significant moves which has been done is by the Indian Space Research Organization, where they have started with a sort of information decision support system on disaster management. It's called as Bhuvan, and it actually gives you quite a lot of layered information of hazards, and you can also look in terms of say last 25 years, where the flood events actually occurred. You can also create layers around it. You can actually download the data, and I think these sort of decision support tools are really going to change. Well, I think that there's quite a bit of duplication that's happening around. I mean, let's look at why it's happening. Let's look at the Disaster Management Act. The Disaster Management Act of 2005 essentially asks for certain documents to be prepared. It says the state should have a plan, the city should have a plan. So plans are prepared based on a very specific notion of disaster risk. Now you have a national action plan on climate change, where the state action plans are actually coming up. But nevertheless, it doesn't really translate into asking cities to have a climate change action plans. But nevertheless, there are a lot of these institutions and donors who are actually working on cities to help cities to come up with a mitigation plan or a resilience plan. So plans are getting prepared. So at a level of a city, it's good in a way that a lot of experiments are happening. A lot of new frameworks are coming up into the cities. So as far as knowledge is concerned, there is a repository of knowledge which is getting created. And the real challenge is, how do we get into doing an integration around it? And I think the missing link is, is one thing. You have a development plan which you prepare for the city, or you also prepare a CDP, which is a sort of an investment plan. There has to be some mechanism where both the CDP and the development plan can take the information which are coming from, different set of plans which are being prepared. Some plans are prepared because there is a set mechanism. There is an act which says that you have to end up doing it. But then when you look at some of the cities which have been able to put up some sort of a climate action plan, it has been really pushed from the donors, or it's been coming as a request from the city government to look in terms of understanding to have a sort of an adaptation or a mitigation plan for climate change. But there is no single institution right now which can actually bring together the whole process. One significant movement which has happened, at least as far as the current CDP, the City Development Plan, is concerned, is the new guidelines which has been brought out by the Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Mission, which actually says that climate change has to be looked into, the disaster management actions has to be looked into. So, but that's sort of a paragraph which is there in the toolkit. But what I think the real challenge is, how do you operationalize getting that onto a sort of a workable CDP, a CDP which takes into account of the information on the climate variability and climate change. It takes into account of say how we can look in terms of water security, not just provision of water to the city, but how can we look at water security, because what infrastructure you're going to put in today has to last for another probably a couple of decades. And I think with the onset of the climate variability, I think a lot of that analysis which has already been done in some of the cities are not really getting into the CDP, and that's quite a challenge. So we have been able to nail it at the level of the guidelines, but I think getting down to the operations part is quite tricky. And one of the areas which I firmly believe why it's lacking is because it's a capacity issue. I mean, we have come across some cities where they have taken a look, or they have taken a stock of the disaster management plan, they have taken stock of the climate resilience strategy, they have taken a stock of the climate action plans. But the challenge with the institution which is actually preparing a CDP is, how do you integrate all that? And there are very few guidelines or mechanisms available to integrate it. So I think sometimes there's also a lack of capacity of an individual or an institution to integrate that into the subject of development processes. So I think that we don't have a firm answer for that right now, but I think the ability to build capacity of institutions could be one way of probably looking at the integration part of it. Or else at the level of the municipal government, there has to be at least one department. At least the planning department should ensure that all that great amount of effort towards undertaking scientific studies or action plans gets integrated into the development agenda of the city. I mean, there are two schools of thought. One school of thought says that, let us integrate it, let us not make it more visible. The other thought says that, we haven't achieved much. And to be very honest, if you look at all the paradigm shift that has happened, right from moving from a hazard-centric to social vulnerability to the decade of the 90s, where a lot of emphasis was on prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. And now, with the advent of the IPCC reports, and we're coming across this whole work around adaptation and resilience, I think there has been a significant shift in understanding the risk, and I think that is really not percolated well within the institutions. So, taking risk out could be quite tricky at this moment. It may be important to sustain talking about it probably for another decade. Did you really see that integration happening across sectors? Because in reality and in practice, even at the level of the national institutions, risk management is concentrated with one or two departments. And again, there's a lack of significant integration. Say, let us look at three broad areas. Let us look at environment management. It was typically done by, globally, it's done by some of the ministries of environment and forest. And in our case, we have a ministry which looks into the climate change. We look about environmental management issues. Then you have a national disaster authority. You have a Ministry of Home Affairs, and then you have an institution. You have a ministry called Ministry of Urban Development. And what the real challenge is, how all these three different ministries look at that risk portfolio. Now, if they all look, there's a sync between the institution, they all look in a particular direction. I would rather say, okay, just take that off. Probably we have done quite a lot of mainstreaming in the last 15, 20 years. So there is no need to roll that word again. But if all of them are taking different opinions and stands on it, it's very important that, first you spend a good lot of energy to make sure that, there is a common approach towards understanding of risk. And what I see, it's not that the word risk doesn't exist in the portfolio of several ministries, but the whole understanding of risk is very different. We don't have a standardized approach towards understanding risk, treating risk, mitigating risk, or communicating risk. And unless and until we bring some sort of a standardized approach, and I would rather say it's not an issue which needs to be only dealt at a global level. I think a lot of these sort of challenges has to be dealt at a national level, where probably one of the best stands, what a country like India can take is to, at least at the policy level, is to agree on a common framework for risk. It should not be, and when I say it's a framework, it's about how do you evaluate a risk, because risk exists across all sectors. Where you're talking about health, you talk about water resources, because there are such large number of dams across the country, and very recently in 2011, there's a report which talked about dams not having emergency action plans. So if you have a large number of dams across the country which doesn't have an emergency action plan, definitely it's an issue of risk. And if a large number of new dams are going to be constructed in the country and they don't have an emergency action plan, when I talk about emergency action plan, it's not just about the structural integrity of the dam. It is all about how dams in this country can also look in terms of handling the climate variability part of it, because the sort of extreme events in terms of rainfall, etc., has a cascadal effect in terms of the water coming to the dam. And can we have a sort of an emergency release? Are the stakeholders below the dam aware of it? So I think risk exists across all ministries. May it be health, may it be transport, may it be X, Y, Z. But we don't operate in a single framework. And so because we don't operate in a single framework, everyone has a different way of understanding risk, treatment of risk, mitigating risk. So I think it's high time that that we get onto a common framework, and that probably helps everybody to take a single direction or a common approach, irrespective of what sectors they actually fall in, and that should be some sort of a quick way forward. But we can't really wait for what's going to come out from the larger global discussions. And I think some of these things have to be done internally. It has to be done quick. Nevertheless, how the global discussions actually turn out. Well, I think as far as the GAR goes, I think over the last couple of years, all the reports did emphasize on a very particular sector. There was an issue which looked into, I think the previous GAR report was talking quite a lot about the corporate sector. There's a whole issue of business continuity which was talked about. There's also debate in terms of how business continuity should not just look in terms of the economic and the financial risk, but how do you also get around to look into issues of natural disasters. And I think we had some serious technological disasters in the past, and probably accidents which are of big nature. I think the current, the current GAR or subsequent GAR reports which come out, there should be some emphasis where there should be a call for standardization of things, how we can measure that risk in the society. Is it on an increasing trend, or is it something which is on a decreasing trend? And I think it's important to have some sort of a dynamic system built in to look in terms of globally, are we really going, what is the sort of monitoring and evaluation framework that we can put collectively to see how much of risk has been reduced in the last 30, 40 years, or maybe even if you take today as a benchmark, can we really see something happening in the next 20 years? Because I think that's sort of a mechanism today, it doesn't really exist. And what we have today is loss and damage figures, and we know this is on an increasing trend. I mean, nevertheless, all that interventions that we have made in the last 30, 40 years, it's on an increasing trend. But I think what GAR can propose is that at least at a level of at a level of each country, there has to be some good monitoring and evaluation framework in terms of how risk is either getting accumulated or is it getting reducing. That's one way of looking at it, and some sort of a standard operating framework, of risk management. And I think that should take into account of your issues of disaster risk reduction. It should take into account of climate change. So it should not be something. But today, we have two different operating frameworks. We have a CCCA framework, we have a DRR framework, and I think it's high time that there is some sort of a convergence that takes between the two. Because if that doesn't happen at a global level, what you see as the biggest challenge in the country is that you have two different operational frameworks for DRR, which is separate, and for climate change, which is separate. And we all know that the climate change part is not something which is very unique, because disaster risk management has been looking into issues of hydromet events, and climate change has to be there has to be some sort of an integration between the CCA. It has to be part of the DRR framework. But I think today we are caught up with this challenge of having two different frameworks, and so is it the question is that can we bring them together? Okay, if we can bring them together, it's well and good. And can we standardize some sort of a framework around it? Well, I think one area which I firmly believe is the disconnect that we have between the science, institutions, and society. And I think on the primary front, as far as the hazard science and the climate science and the science part is concerned, I think if you really measure in terms of the significant improvements, I think we have done fairly good. I mean, there is a lot of issues of the issues of uncertainty will remain, but nevertheless, we have done fairly good in that area. The real challenge of taking that science to the society still exists, particularly in the developing countries, where there's no relation between what is happening at the science front and what's happening at the societal front. The society continues to take decisions and is not being really informed by all the technical work that is being done around the hazard science or the climate science. And then via media institutions, what I think we discussed, I also mentioned about this earlier, the institutional capacity is significantly weak. I mean, there are very few institutions in the country. I mean, there are institutions. The issue is not about not having institutions. The institutions are there all around. But this whole paradigm of disaster risk management, climate change, has not been percolated into a large number of institutions. They're either resting with institutions which have this term called disaster management or a disaster management cell. The real integration of the subject of disaster risk management, climate change has not gone into a large number of institutions. And I think it's that institutional capacity building which I think is a sort of an area where a significant amount of resources and significant amount of time has to be spent on. And I think it's strengthening these institutions will probably probably bring up some sort of a change. So I think that's all I have to say.